At 6:42 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on Tuesday, July 28, 1981, the illusion finally collapsed inside the Brooklyn circles of the Bonanno crime family, and the man most exposed by the revelation was Lefty Ruggiero. The confirmation did not arrive with shouting. It did not arrive with gunfire. It moved quietly from one trusted voice to another until doubt hardened into certainty. Donnie Brasco was gone, and Donnie Brasco had never existed. For nearly 6 years, the man known by that name had sat in smoke-filled back rooms, discussed collections, observed disputes, and earned the guarded acceptance of men who trusted almost no one. He had been patient. He had been disciplined. He had been deliberate. He had also been Joseph Pistone, operating under deep cover. To understand why the revelation cut so deeply, one must return to the beginning, not of the investigation, but of the bond. At 8:15 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on Thursday, September 30, 1976, in a modest social club in Brooklyn, Lefty first began taking the young jewel thief seriously. The introduction was unremarkable. No ceremony. No dramatic tension. Just a name, a background story, and the quiet assessment that follows any newcomer into a closed world. Lefty had survived in that world through loyalty rather than brilliance. He was not a powerful captain. He was not a major earner. He struggled with gambling debts that eroded his standing and kept him in constant need of opportunity. Yet he believed in the structure of the family. He believed in hierarchy, in obedience, in the idea that endurance would eventually be rewarded. When Donnie entered his orbit, Lefty recognized something familiar: ambition without arrogance. The newcomer listened more than he spoke. He deferred when appropriate. He asked careful questions. In an environment built on suspicion, restraint is persuasive. Months turned into years. At 11:03 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Saturday, March 18, 1978, Lefty did something irreversible. He vouched for Donnie in front of other members. Within organized crime, vouching is not casual approval. It is shared liability. It declares that another man's conduct reflects your judgment. If he fails, you fail. If he lies, you answer. Lefty understood the risk. He accepted it anyway. What he could not see was the meticulous discipline behind Donnie's composure. Pistone was not improvising. He was documenting. He memorized names, alliances, rivalries, and procedures. He absorbed the culture, the language, the hierarchy. Each conversation expanded a federal case that was being constructed far beyond the view of the men speaking freely around him. By the spring of 1981, pressure from federal investigations was intensifying. At 2:17 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on Tuesday, May 5, 1981, key prosecutorial steps were finalized that would soon expose the depth of the infiltration. Inside the family, however, tension was attributed to politics and rivalry, not betrayal. The first whispers began late. At 10:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on Sunday, July 26, 1981, questions circulated in subdued tones. How had federal authorities gained such precise knowledge of internal discussions? Why did indictments align so closely with private meetings? The name Donnie surfaced cautiously. Lefty dismissed the suspicion. To doubt Donnie was to doubt his own judgment, and Lefty's identity was bound tightly to that judgment. He had invested years of mentorship and protection. He had tied his credibility to the younger man's rise. 2 days later, the truth could no longer be contained. When confirmation arrived on July 28, it did more than expose an undercover agent. It exposed vulnerability within a system that prided itself on impermeability. Another figure within the family, Sonny Black, would ultimately pay with his life for permitting such proximity to authority. The punishment was not impulsive, it was symbolic. Lefty's consequences unfolded differently. At 9:05 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on Friday, January 14, 1982, A steel door closed behind him at Rikers Island following his indictment on racketeering charges tied to the operation. Prison removed him from immediate retaliation, but it did not restore his reputation. In the calculus of organized crime, he had failed in the most humiliating way possible. He had trusted incorrectly. The tragedy of Lefty Ruggiero was not rooted in greed or treachery. It was rooted in belief that loyalty still held weight in a structure where suspicion was the true currency. He sought validation, advancement, and recognition within a rigid hierarchy. Instead, he became the unwitting conduit through which federal authorities penetrated one of New York's major crime families. At 6:42 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on July 28, 1981, the illusion ended. What remained was a cautionary testament to the cost of misplaced trust in a world where trust is rarely survivable. At 8:15 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on Thursday, November 9, 1978, Lefty Ruggiero poured his second drink of the night at a quiet Brooklyn bar tucked away from the main street. Smoke clung to the ceiling like fog, and the low hum of conversation barely reached the edges of his awareness. Donnie Brasco, or so Lefty believed, sat across from him, studying the table, asking questions that were just curious enough to seem innocent. Over the years, their bond had deepened into what Lefty considered mentorship. He had brought Donnie to meetings with captains and mid-level earners. He had guided him through collections, introduced him to trusted allies, and corrected his mistakes with patience. Every shared meal, every whispered warning, every minor lesson in etiquette cemented trust. What Lefty did not realize was that trust, in this case, was a trap. By 9:22 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Tuesday, March 21, 1979, Pistone had already begun cataloging the patterns of Lefty's behavior. Every movement, every reaction, every word spoken in confidence was recorded and filed. The FBI had taught him patience. The operation was not a sprint but a slow, deliberate infiltration. Lefty's errors were subtle. His loyalty blinded him to inconsistencies in Donnie's stories. Small gaps in background checks, odd pauses, unusual timing, they seemed trivial, ignorable. But to Pistone, every detail was data. Every lapse was a window into the Bonanno inner workings. At 7:45 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on Friday, October 12, 1979, the two men sat in a dim corner of a Brooklyn social club discussing a minor debt collection. Lefty offered guidance, spoke with pride, and subtly bragged about his influence over the younger man. Donnie nodded, laughed when prompted, and carefully mirrored Lefty's gestures. It was flawless mimicry, designed to appear loyal while simultaneously extracting information. The deeper Lefty pulled Donnie into the family, the greater the risk became. By spring of 1980, he was actively defending him to higher-ups, including Sonny Black. Lefty vouched for Donnie repeatedly, assuring skeptics that the newcomer was trustworthy. Every defense made Lefty more exposed. Every recommendation tied his reputation to someone he did not truly know. At 3:16 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on Monday, April 7, 1980, Pistone attended a meeting with the Bonanno leadership, a meeting Lefty had insisted he attend. Lefty watched the dynamics carefully, thinking he was teaching Donnie the unspoken rules of hierarchy. In reality, he was handing the FBI a roadmap. Alliances, rivalries, financial arrangements, and weak points all cataloged with precision. Warnings came too late. By 10:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on Saturday, May 17, 1981, murmurs within the family began to acknowledge that Donnie might not be who he claimed. Yet even then, Lefty's instinct was to protect, not suspect. Loyalty, in his mind, outweighed conjecture. The idea that he had been deceived never occurred to him. 2 months later, on Tuesday, July 28, 1981, the revelation was complete. Donnie Brasco was Joseph Pistone. The FBI had succeeded beyond imagination. The family's secrets were laid bare. Executions followed swiftly. Sonny Black paid with his life. Lefty was arrested and later sent to prison, spared death only by circumstance and strategy, but not by judgment. Prison was a quiet teacher. At 9:05 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on Friday, January 14, 1982, as the steel door closed behind him at Rikers Island, Lefty had nothing but time to replay the past. Every conversation, every gesture, every misplaced word of trust now carried the weight of betrayal. In those early months of incarceration, Lefty began to confront the psychological consequences of his choices. He realized the full cost of mentorship misapplied, the dangers of blurred judgment, and the peril of empathy in a world designed for suspicion. He had been too human for a system that demanded perfection. By mid-1982, the story of Lefty Ruggiero became more than a personal tragedy. It was a cautionary tale about the cost of loyalty, the dangers of blind trust, and the brutal calculus of the American Mafia. Every name he had spoken for, every door he had opened, had consequences he could no longer control. Part III will explore how Lefty attempted to navigate prison life, the psychological torment of survival in isolation, and how the legacy of his trust continued to echo through the streets he once ruled. At 7:50 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on Monday, February 15, 1982, Lefty Ruggiero awoke in his cell at Rikers Island. The clanging of metal doors and distant shouts formed a rhythm he would learn to anticipate, a pulse as rigid and unforgiving as the world he had left behind. Prison was quieter than the streets, but it was no less brutal. There was no camaraderie, only observation, calculation, and survival. Lefty spent hours replaying every moment with Donnie Brasco in his mind, every shared laugh, every whispered instruction, every meeting he had vouched for. Each memory was sharpened by regret, but sharpened truths are often the hardest to endure. He had been patient, loyal, protective, and yet, in doing so, he had delivered the family into enemy hands. By 3:12 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on Wednesday, March 17, 1982, news of executions reached the prison through whispered updates and smuggled papers. Sonny Black, once a friend and protector, had been found dead in a shallow grave. His hands were missing, a gruesome message to anyone who might betray or misjudge loyalty. Lefty felt a hollow ache, knowing he had been spared only by circumstance. Survival, he realized, was not always mercy. In the weeks that followed, Lefty became introspective. The hierarchy he had spent years navigating no longer existed in a tangible form, but it lived in his mind. He began to dissect his own decisions, why he had trusted, why he had vouched, and why he had failed to see the subtle signs of deception. Each reflection was a lesson in human vulnerability, a reminder that in a world built on suspicion, empathy could be fatal. At 6:18 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on Friday, May 7, 1982, Lefty was allowed an hour outside the cell block in the prison yard. He walked the narrow concrete paths, feeling the chill of the late spring evening. The sky above was clear, indifferent, vast. In that expanse he thought of the social clubs of Brooklyn, dimly lit rooms filled with smoke, laughter, and power. He thought of the streets, the deals, the hierarchy, the code. And he understood that he had belonged to a world that measured everything by blood, loyalty, and consequence. By 10:04 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on Monday, June 28, 1982, Lefty began corresponding with a few trusted associates outside. Letters were slow, deliberate, and coded. They were his only lifeline to the world he had known, a fragile bridge between survival and memory. Each sentence was weighed, each word calculated. One wrong phrase could invite suspicion, even in absence. The psychological burden of betrayal became his constant companion. Sleep was elusive. Conversations in the dayroom were filtered through caution. Every smile, every glance reminded him of Donnie Brasco and the choices he had made. He was haunted not only by what had happened, but by what he had allowed to happen, the trust extended, the mentorship given, the doors opened. By 4:23 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on Thursday, August 12, 1982, Lefty realized that the lesson of his life was a double-edged truth. Loyalty could elevate, but misplaced loyalty could destroy. He had survived physically, but psychologically, he was navigating a terrain as dangerous as any street corner in Brooklyn. Every memory of friendship, betrayal, and devotion was a map of both triumph and failure. Lefty's story was no longer just about a man and an FBI agent. It was about the fragility of human judgment, the subtle power of trust, and the devastating consequences when loyalty collides with deception. Part IV will explore Lefty Ruggiero's later years, the lingering shadow of Donnie Brasco, and how a soldier who survived the Mafia's wrath ultimately confronted the cost of believing in others. At 9:15 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on Tuesday, September 14, 1983, Lefty Ruggiero stepped into the visiting room at Rikers Island. The clatter of metal doors echoed off concrete walls, a harsh percussion that marked the passing of time. Years had softened the edges of his face, but the eyes, sharp, restless, betrayed a mind constantly at work, dissecting every past decision, every misjudged trust, every loyalty extended too far. He thought again of Donnie Brasco, the man he had mentored, protected, and unknowingly exposed to federal scrutiny. He thought of the countless hours spent in dimly lit clubs, discussing minor schemes, sharing drinks, offering guidance. Each memory was a dagger now, sharp and precise. The bond that had once seemed a bridge to relevance had been a trapdoor. At 3:42 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on Friday, March 16, 1984, Lefty received a letter from an old associate, a man still active on the streets of Brooklyn. The letter was brief, almost cryptic. "The streets remember. Some things survive even when we don't." Lefty read it twice, then folded it carefully. The truth was undeniable. His reputation had been shattered, his name forever linked to one of the most infamous FBI infiltrations in American Mafia history. By 7:08 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on Monday, July 16, 1985, Lefty had begun to reflect on the nature of loyalty and betrayal, not as abstract concepts, but as personal realities he had lived. Loyalty had been his compass, guiding him through the labyrinth of organized crime, yet it had also been his undoing. Misplaced trust had opened doors that should have remained closed. Mentorship had allowed deception to flourish. Friendship had become complicity. At 10:37 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time on Tuesday, December 2, 1986, Lefty was released from federal custody after serving his sentence. The streets of Brooklyn were familiar yet alien. Buildings had changed. Clubs had closed or moved. Faces he remembered had vanished. Yet the lessons of the past remained indelibly etched in his mind. He understood now that survival was not just physical but psychological. The ability to process betrayal, to reconcile with one's own judgment, was the ultimate measure of endurance. At 6:42 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on Wednesday, July 28, 1987, exactly 6 years after the revelation of Donnie Brasco's true identity, Lefty sat in a quiet apartment overlooking the Brooklyn waterfront. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and violet. He lit a cigarette, inhaled slowly, and exhaled the weight of memory. He was alive, a survivor in a world that demanded perfection, yet he carried the scars of lessons learned too late. Lefty's story is more than a tale of infiltration and deception. It is a study of human vulnerability, the frailty of judgment, and the peril of misplaced trust. In the end, Lefty Ruggiero survived not because he was the strongest or the smartest, but because he endured, and endured with the bitter knowledge of what loyalty, when betrayed, could truly cost. Even decades later, the echo of his choices reverberates through the streets of Brooklyn, a cautionary tale for anyone who believes that trust is a simple currency in a world built on suspicion, power, and blood. The name Lefty Ruggiero lives on not as a legend of wealth or power, but as the soldier who believed, who guided, who mentored, and ultimately, who paid for his trust in the harshest currency imaginable.